There comes a moment in love where words no longer travel between two souls, yet energy still does. Two people can stop speaking, stop reaching, stop appearing in each other's lives, and still remain deeply entangled in the unseen field of emotional memory. And when a dismissive avoidant and you both choose silence, it is not simply an ending, it is a spiritual pause that begins to reveal what was never understood in the presence of connection. At first, silence feels like control. It feels like distance has restored balance. The dismissive avoidant often steps into this space with a sense of relief, as if emotional pressure has finally dissolved. And you, on the other side, may feel the sharp echo of absence, wondering if detachment means replacement, forgetting, or erasure. But what neither side realizes in that moment is that silence is not empty. It is alive. It begins working on both hearts in different, unseen ways, because what leaves your life does not always leave your nervous system. The avoidant mind, which once created safety through emotional distance, begins to experience something subtle but undeniable. At first, it is quiet, almost unnoticeable. Life continues, routines continue, distractions work as they always have. But beneath that surface, something starts to shift. Emotional suppression is not emotional resolution, and what is suppressed does not vanish. It waits. There is a point where the absence of emotional connection becomes heavier than the presence of emotional conflict ever was, not immediately, not dramatically, but slowly, like a truth rising through water that can no longer stay submerged. The very silence that once felt like freedom begins to carry weight, not because the person is missed in a romanticized way, but because emotional imprint does not respect avoidance strategies. It lives in memory, sensation, and unresolved energy, and you, in your silence, begin your own journey. At first, it may feel like abandonment, like being chosen out of someone's emotional world. But if you stay with the silence instead of running from it, something sacred begins to unfold. You start to see clearly what was once distorted by hope, attachment, and emotional longing. You begin to understand that love was never meant to require self-abandonment to be maintained. And in that realization, something inside you starts to reclaim its dignity. Because silence is not only what separates, it is what reveals. When communication stops, illusion weakens. You begin to see the pattern without emotional interference. You see the cycles, the inconsistency, the emotional withdrawal, and return that once kept you hoping. And in that clarity, you are no longer negotiating for love, you are observing it. And this is where the transformation begins, for both souls, even if they are unaware of it. The dismissive avoidant, who once believed distance was emotional safety, eventually encounters the paradox of that belief. Distance protects them from overwhelm, but it also disconnects them from depth. And depth, once experienced, cannot be fully forgotten. So even in their emotional independence, something inside begins to ask quiet questions. Questions that do not demand answers immediately, but do not leave either. And you, in your separation, begin to rebuild your emotional center. Not around someone else's presence, but around your own truth. You stop asking, why weren't they enough for me to stay? And begin asking, why did I abandon myself trying to be chosen? This is where healing becomes divine. Because true emotional growth does not come from reunion, it comes from realization. From the sacred moment when you stop confusing intensity with intimacy and stop confusing distance with indifference. You begin to understand that love without emotional safety is not love that sustains. It is love that drains. And in that understanding, something within you becomes free. Silence, then, is no longer punishment. It becomes purification. It removes what was never stable. It reveals what was never reciprocal. It refines your emotional truth until what remains is clarity, not confusion. And in this space, something profound happens. Both souls are being recalibrated, not by each other, but by the experience itself. Because connection, once real, does not disappear. It transforms into awareness. And awareness changes everything. What happens next is not predictable. Sometimes paths cross again. Sometimes they do not. But the deeper truth is this: if reconnection ever happens, it will not be the same version of love that was lost. It will either be awakened love or it will not return at all. Because once silence has spoken its truth, illusion cannot fully return. So you are not waiting. You are evolving. You are stepping out of emotional dependency and into emotional sovereignty. And that is where your energy begins to shift from longing to wholeness. And when a soul becomes whole, it no longer chases what once made it feel incomplete. When both a dismissive avoidant and you stop contacting each other, silence does not simply function as the absence of communication. It becomes an active psychological and emotional mirror that begins to reflect truths neither person was fully able to see during interaction. In the presence of contact, emotions are constantly interpreted through reaction, texts, replies, tone, timing, distance, closeness. All of these external signals shape perception and often distort inner truth. But when communication stops entirely, those external signals disappear, and what remains is raw internal reality. For both individuals, this sudden quiet space forces the nervous system to stop responding to triggers and start processing unresolved emotional material. In that stillness, the mind no longer has distractions to project meaning onto, so it begins to turn inward. For someone with dismissive, avoidant tendencies, silence initially feels like restoration of control and emotional safety because it removes perceived pressure, expectation, and emotional demand. However, what begins as relief slowly transforms into an unfamiliar internal stillness that is no longer about freedom from others, but confrontation with self. Without external emotional engagement, the avoidance mind is left with fragments of memory, emotional impressions, and suppressed experiences that were previously pushed aside in order to maintain detachment. These fragments do not demand immediate attention, but they accumulate in subtle waves of reflection, often surfacing in moments of inactivity, fatigue, or emotional vulnerability. On the other side, the person who once reached out may initially interpret silence as rejection, finality, or emotional replacement. Yet as time progresses, their own emotional system also begins to recalibrate. The urgency to seek response gradually fades, and in its place emerges clarity about patterns that were previously overlooked due to emotional attachment. Silence, in this way, becomes a revealing force that strips away illusion. It removes the interpretive noise created by inconsistent communication and allows both individuals to see the relationship not through moments of intensity, but through the larger pattern of emotional exchange. What once felt confusing begins to organize itself into understanding. The mind starts to recognize cycles, emotional gaps, repeated withdrawals, and the imbalance between presence and absence. This recognition is not immediate. It unfolds gradually as emotional dependency weakens and awareness strengthens. Silence also reveals emotional truth because it removes the ability to perform relational identity. In communication, people often unconsciously present versions of themselves shaped by fear, desire, or protection. But when interaction ceases, there is no longer a need to maintain those adaptive versions. What remains is the unfiltered self, which both individuals are eventually required to confront. The avoidant may begin to notice not just relief in distance, but also the emotional cost of constant detachment, the subtle loneliness that cannot always be rationalized away. Meanwhile, the other person may begin to see how much of their emotional energy was invested in uncertainty rather than reciprocity. In this shared silence, even though they are apart, both are undergoing parallel processes of emotional stripping, removing attachment layers, expectations, and assumptions. The mirror of silence does not show what is desired. It shows what is real, and what is real is often uncomfortable at first, because it does not align with the narratives built during emotional involvement. But discomfort in this context is not destruction. it is clarity emerging. Over time, both individuals begin to realize that silence is not empty space, but reflective space, where emotional truth becomes unavoidable. It reveals what was genuine connection and what was attachment driven by fear or hope. It shows where emotional responsibility was shared and where it was avoided. And most importantly, it exposes the internal state of each person without the distortion of interaction. In this way, silence becomes a teacher. No. An ending. It does not speak in words, but in realization, and what it reveals cannot be unseen once understood. At the beginning of silence, a dismissive avoidant often experiences what feels like emotional relief, and this response is deeply rooted in their nervous system's learned association between distance and safety. When emotional intensity, expectations, or relational demands are removed, the internal system that once felt overstimulated finally downshifts. There is no longer the pressure to respond, to interpret emotions, to manage closeness, or to navigate vulnerability. This sudden absence of demand creates a sense of spaciousness inside the mind, almost like an unclenching after prolonged tension. For someone who is wired to associate closeness with emotional overwhelm, the space is interpreted as peace. The external world becomes quieter, and so does the internal conflict that usually arises when intimacy begins to feel consuming. In this early stage, the avoidant mind convinces itself that separation confirms stability, that distance has restored emotional control, and that independence has been successfully reclaimed. This is the psychological surface of relief, and it feels convincing because it aligns with their protective strategy of deactivation. However, this relief is not a final emotional state, it is a transitional one. Beneath the calm surface, the emotional system does not actually resolve connection, it merely suppresses it. The absence of relational interaction does not erase attachment, it pauses its expression. And what is paused does not disappear, it settles into quieter layers of consciousness. As days pass and external distractions resume their normal rhythm, the initial relief begins to lose its intensity. The nervous system, no longer in a reactive state, slowly starts to recalibrate. In this recalibrate phase, the mind begins to notice subtle gaps. These are not dramatic emotional waves at first, but small interruptions in the internal landscape, a moment of unexplained memory, a fleeting image, a sensation triggered by familiarity, or an emotional echo that does not fully dissolve when ignored. These experiences do not immediately register as longing, but they begin to weaken the certainty of emotional detachment. Over time, what starts as quiet neutrality can evolve into a form of emotional discomfort that is harder to define. The avoidant individual may not identify it as missing someone. Instead, it may appear as restlessness, irritability, or a vague sense that something is unresolved. This is because their emotional system is not designed to process attachment through conscious acknowledgement. Instead, it processes through indirect signals that bypass rational defense mechanisms. The relief that once came from absence gradually transforms into a subtle awareness that absence itself is not emotionally neutral. It carries weight, even if unspoken. As the emotional imprint of the connection persists, the mind begins to revisit stored interactions, not in a linear or logical way, but in fragments. These fragments are often triggered during moments of stillness, such as late-night reflection, repetitive routines, or emotional lows that temporarily reduce psychological defenses. In those moments, the avoidant individual may find themselves recalling specific expressions, conversations, or emotional tones that were previously dismissed or minimized. What makes this stage complex is that the recall is not accompanied by immediate action or expression. Instead, it exists internally without resolution, creating a quiet tension between what was felt and what was avoided. This is where the transformation of relief into discomfort becomes more pronounced. The absence of relational pressure no longer feels purely freeing. It begins to reveal emotional emptiness that was previously masked by avoidance itself. the very mechanism that created safety. Distance also removes the stimulation that once gave emotional life its contrast. Without that contrast, internal stillness can start to feel unfamiliar, even slightly unsettling. The mind may attempt to rationalize this discomfort by attributing it to stress, routine dissatisfaction, or unrelated life factors. But beneath those explanations lies an unresolved emotional residue. Eventually, this subtle discomfort becomes part of the internal background. It does not overwhelm, but it persists. It coexists with daily life, often unnoticed consciously but felt emotionally. The avoidant individual may still believe they are fine, still in control, still detached, yet the emotional system tells a different story in quieter ways. Relief fades not because something external changes, but because the internal system begins to recognize that absence does not equate to resolution. What was once perceived as emotional freedom gradually reveals itself as emotional suppression without closure. And in that realization, discomfort begins to replace the initial sense of calm. What remains after contact stops is not just memory in the ordinary sense, but an emotional imprint that lives beneath conscious awareness, embedded in the nervous system, like a subtle residue of experience. When a dismissive avoidant and you go into complete silence, the absence of interaction does not erase what was formed between you. Instead, it shifts the relationship from external expression to internal storage. Everything that was once exchanged through words, reactions, presence, and emotional energy becomes encoded in the subconscious as a relational pattern. This is why your absence does not simply fade away from their system, even if on the surface they appear unaffected. The mind can detach from engagement, but the emotional body retains traces of connection that are not easily dissolved through avoidance or distraction. In the early phase of silence, the avoidant mind relies heavily on deactivation strategies, meaning it reduces emotional significance by focusing on logic, independence, or external tasks. This creates the illusion that the connection is no longer impactful. However, emotional imprinting does not operate through logic. It operates through repetition, intensity, and emotional charge. If the connection carried moments of emotional activation, whether comfort, tension, closeness, or inconsistency, those moments become stored as associative memory fragments. These fragments are not always accessible through conscious recall, but they remain active beneath awareness, influencing subtle emotional responses over time. As silence continues, the nervous system begins to encounter triggers that it cannot immediately rationalize. These triggers may not be obvious or directly linked to the person, but they activate the same emotional pathways associated with the connection. A place, a phrase, a time of day, or even a particular emotional state can act as a key that unlocks stored impressions. When this happens, the avoidant individual may experience a brief emotional shift that feels unconnected to any clear thought. This is the imprint surfacing without narrative, which can be confusing for a mind that prefers emotional compartmentalization. What makes this imprint significant is that it is not dependent on conscious desire or ongoing contact. It exists independently of active thinking. Even when the avoidant believes they have moved on, the emotional system retains a record of relational intensity. This is especially true when the connection involved moments of vulnerability that were not fully processed or expressed. Vulnerability leaves deeper imprints because it activates attachment systems that are not easily turned off. When those moments are followed by withdrawal or silence, the emotional system does not receive closure. Instead, it stores the experience as incomplete emotional data. Over time, this stored data begins to interact with the avoidant's internal world in subtle ways. It may influence mood shifts, create fleeting nostalgia, or generate unexplained emotional restlessness. These experiences are often not labeled as missing someone because the avoidant structure tends to avoid direct emotional interpretation. Instead, the imprint manifests indirectly through sensations or shifts in internal equilibrium. The mind may try to attribute these sensations to general life dissatisfaction, stress, or unrelated concerns, but the emotional pattern remains rooted in the relational imprint. Meanwhile, the absence of your presence does not mean absence of impact. Silence does not delete significance, it preserves it in a different form. What was once external interaction becomes internal echo. And echoes, by their nature, repeat without needing the original source to be present. This is why emotional imprints can feel distant yet still present, forgotten yet still influential. They do not demand attention constantly, but they resurface at moments when the mind is least defended, often during stillness or emotional vulnerability. In this way, your absence becomes something paradoxical in the avoidance internal world. On the surface, it may appear irrelevant, but beneath that surface, it continues to exist as an unresolved emotional trace. It is not always experienced as longing in a direct sense, but it is experienced as a subtle reorientation of internal familiarity, something once integrated into their emotional landscape. Ape is no longer accessible externally, yet remains internally registered. This mismatch between external absence and internal presence is what creates the lingering effect of emotional imprinting, where the connection does not end, but continues in a quieter, more hidden form within the subconscious architecture of the mind. When both a dismissive avoidant and you stop contacting each other, something subtle yet profound happens beneath the surface of emotional awareness. The power dynamic that once shaped the relationship begins to dissolve and reconfigure itself. During active connection, especially in relationships marked by anxious avoidant patterns, emotional energy is rarely balanced. One person often reaches, pursues, clarifies, or seeks reassurance, while the other withdraws, distances, or regulates intimacy through space. This creates an invisible structure of push and pull where attention itself becomes a form of emotional currency. Whoever is reaching more appears to hold less power in the moment, while whoever is withdrawing appears to hold more control over distance and timing. But this perception of power is not stable, it is reactive, built on interaction rather than truth. When contact stops completely, the entire framework that supported this imbalance begins to collapse. There is no longer pursuit, no longer withdrawal, no longer response to regulate or react against. In this absence, both individuals are forced out of relational positioning and into individual existence. What once looked like control through distance or control through pursuit becomes irrelevant because there is nothing left to control externally. Silence removes the stage on which these roles were being performed. And when the stage disappears, so do the roles that depended on it. At first, this can feel unsettling for both sides, but in different ways. The person who once pursued may initially feel a loss of emotional direction, as if the natural instinct to reach outward has been cut off mid-expression. The dismissive avoidant, on the other hand, may feel an initial sense of regained autonomy, as though emotional pressure has finally lifted. However, this early perception is misleading because it is still based on the memory of interaction. As silence extends, both individuals begin to shift from reaction-based living to reflection-based awareness. And in reflection, power is no longer measured by who withdraws or who pursues, but by who begins to understand what actually happened within the dynamic. The absence of contact creates an equalizing effect. Without communication, there is no opportunity to interpret tone, no opportunity to analyze response time, no opportunity to infer emotional states from behavior. This removes the constant micro-adjustments that typically maintain emotional imbalance. In the quiet that follows, both nervous systems begin to recalibrate independently. The urgency that once dictated behavior starts to fade, and with it, the illusion that one person held more control over the emotional outcome. For the dismissive avoidant, this shift is particularly significant because their sense of control is often linked to emotional distance. Distance feels like safety because it allows them to regulate intimacy on their own terms. But when distance becomes permanent silence, it no longer functions as regulation. It becomes absence. And absence does not respond. It does not respond. This introduces a different kind of experience, one where control has no outlet. The absence of response removes the feedback loop that previously validated their emotional strategy. Over time, this can subtly shift internal perception from control to uncertainty, even if it is not consciously acknowledged. For the other person, the shift operates differently. Initially, silence may feel like loss of influence, as if reaching has been rendered powerless. But as emotional dependence weakens and self reflection deepens, something else begins to emerge: detachment from the need to influence the other's behavior. This is where real power begins to shift internally. Not the power over another person, but the power to no longer be emotionally dictated by their availability or absence. In this stage, emotional clarity starts to replace emotional urgency, and clarity changes perception entirely. What becomes evident in silence is that the original power dynamic was never truly about strength or weakness, but about nervous system regulation. One system sought closeness to feel secure, while the other sought distance to feel safe. Both were attempting to regulate emotional intensity in different ways. When contact ends, both systems lose their external regulation tools and are forced to develop internal stability. This internalization is what dissolves the previous imbalance. As time passes, neither pursuit nor withdrawal holds significance anymore. What replaces it is awareness of patterns. The mind begins to see that what once felt like control was actually compulsion, and what once felt like power was actually protection. This realization subtly neutralizes the emotional hierarchy that existed during interaction. Neither person is actively positioned above the other anymore because the structure that created comparison no longer exists. In this quiet recalibration, both individuals begin to exist on equal emotional ground, not because they have reconciled, but because the dynamic that created imbalance has dissolved into stillness, and in stillness, there is no pursuit to outrun, no distance to maintain, and no reaction to provoke. There is only the unfolding awareness of how the connection functioned, and how silence has now redefined what power actually means within it. When both a dismissive avoidant and you stop contacting each other, what begins in silence is not just emotional distance, but a forced return to the self. And this return is where growth begins, not in a dramatic or immediately visible way, but in the quiet dismantling of external dependency. As long as contact exists, the mind remains partially outward facing. It interprets, reacts, anticipates, and adjusts based on the presence of another person. Emotional energy is constantly being exchanged, even in inconsistency, and this exchange creates a loop where meaning is continuously derived from someone else's behavior. But when that loop is broken completely, the mind can no longer outsource interpretation. It is left alone with its own patterns, beliefs, and emotional reactions. This is where self-reflection begins. Whether it is welcomed or not, for the dismissive avoidant, this silence removes the usual escape routes of emotional avoidance. In connection, they often regulate internal discomfort by creating distance, redirecting attention, or minimizing emotional significance. But when there is no longer a relationship to step away from, avoidance loses its external function. What remains is the internal world that was previously bypassed. This is not immediately experienced as emotional depth. At first, it often appears as neutrality or distraction. Yet over time, without relational stimulation, the mind begins to encounter its own unprocessed emotional material. Thoughts that were previously suppressed or deprioritized begin to surface in fragmented forms, not as overwhelming waves, but as subtle intrusions. Memories, sensations, or unresolved impressions that arise without invitation. For the other person, the process begins differently but leads to a similar internal turning point. The ABSI, nace of contact, initially activates attachment responses: questioning, longing, analysis, and emotional searching. The mind attempts to restore external connection as a way to restore internal stability. But when no response comes, the emotional system gradually learns that external resolution is not available. This is where the shift begins. The energy that was once directed outward slowly starts to turn inward. Instead of asking, "What are they thinking?" or "Why did they stop?" the mind begins, sometimes painfully, to ask, "Why did I stay in something where I had to constantly question my place?" This inward turn is the beginning of true reflection. And reflection is not comfortable at first because it interrupts emotional narratives that were built during attachment. It exposes patterns that were previously justified by hope, chemistry, or potential. It reveals where self-abandonment may have occurred in the name of connection. And most importantly, it brings awareness to emotional cycles that were normalized while inside the relationship dynamic. Growth does not happen in the moment of silence itself, but in the resistance to it, and then the eventual acceptance of it. At first, both individuals may try to mentally return to the connection, replay conversations, or imagine alternative outcomes. But over time, the mind becomes less focused on rewriting the past and more focused on understanding it. This is where emotional maturity begins to form, not through reconciliation, but through comprehension. The ability to see what was happening without distortion is a key part of internal evolution. For the dismissive avoidant, growth often emerges through subtle realizations rather than emotional breakthroughs. They may begin to notice patterns in their own distancing behavior, or recognize that relief from intimacy does not always equate to fulfillment. They may not bell these realizations as emotional growth immediately, but they begin to register as internal contradictions, moments where independence feels stable but not necessarily deeply satisfying. These contradictions slowly encourage introspection, even if it is gradual and unspoken. For the other person, growth often comes through emotional honesty that can no longer be avoided. Without contact, there is no external distraction from internal truth. The absence forces clarity about what was tolerated, what was hoped for, and what was repeatedly ignored. This clarity can be uncomfortable, but it is also liberating. It begins to separate emotional attachment from self-worth and desire from necessity. Over time, this separation creates a new internal foundation where emotional validation is no longer dependent on another person's presence or response. In this shared silence, both individuals are no longer defined by their interaction, but by their interpretation of it. And interpretation is where growth becomes possible, because once experience is no longer being actively lived, it becomes something that can be understood. The emotional noise fades, and what remains is awareness. And awareness, even when born from disconnection, becomes the starting point of transformation. What feels like an ending in silence is often misunderstood because the human mind is wired to interpret absence as conclusion. When communication stops between a dismissive avoidant and you, the immediate assumption is that something has finished, been discarded, or permanently closed. But on a deeper emotional and even psychological level, silence rarely functions as a true ending. Instead, it operates more like a suspended state, a pause where emotional reality is no longer being actively expressed, but is still internally processing. This is why silence often feels unresolved, rather than complete. It oves interaction, but it does not automatically remove emotional consequence. In the absence of contact, both individuals enter a period where the conscious story of the relationship stops moving forward, yet the subconscious processing continues. Emotional experiences do not fully resolve at the exact moment communication ends. They require integration. Integration happens in reflection, in time, and in emotional recalibration. This is why silence often feels like a gap between what happened externally and what is still unfolding internally. The mind may label it as over, but the emotional system continues to work through meaning, attachment, memory, and identity impact long after interaction has ceased. This is where the idea of a divine pause becomes relevant. Not in a literal or religious sense, but in the sense of timing that exceeds human control. In many emotional dynamics, especially those involving attachment imbalance, people seek immediate closure because uncertainty feels uncomfortable, but silence denies immediate closure. Instead, it forces both individuals into an interval where clarity cannot be forced, only revealed through time. This interval strips away reactive emotion and gradually exposes underlying truth. What was once driven by urgency becomes slowed into awareness. For the dismissive avoidant, this pause can initially feel like restoration of equilibrium. The absence of emotional demand allows their system to stabilize. However, as time continues, the emotional significance of what was disconnected does not remain static. It begins to reorganize itself internally. The mind may revisit moments that were previously minimized or emotionally flattened, not in a way that immediately changes behavior, but in a way that subtly alters internal perception. The emotional meaning of the connection begins to shift when it is no longer being actively defended against or distanced from. For the other person, the divine pause often begins with emotional disruption. The absence creates questions, emotional searching, and attempts to regain meaning through thought. But over time, as no external answers arrive, the focus slowly turns inward. Instead of seeking resolution from the outside, the mind begins to generate understanding from within. This transition from external seeking to internal reflection is one of the most important emotional shifts in human attachment experience. It marks the beginning of emotional independence. Then, if it is born from confusion or pain, what makes this pause divine? In its function is that it removes interference. During interaction, emotional truth is often mixed with reaction, hope, fear, assumption, and defense. But in silence, those layers begin to fall away. There is no new behavior to interpret, no new signals to decode. Only memory remains, and memory becomes clearer when it is no longer being continuously rewritten by new experiences. This allows both individuals to eventually see the relationship in a more structured, less emotionally distorted way. However, this clarity does not arrive instantly. It emerges gradually as emotional intensity decreases. In the beginning, silence can amplify confusion, emotional attachment, or even relief depending on the individual. But over time, the emotional charge begins to settle. And when emotional charge settles, perception changes. What once felt chaotic begins to form patterns. What once felt personal begins to look systemic. And what once felt like conclusion begins to feel more like transition. This is why what happens next is not fixed or predictable. Silence does not guarantee reunion, nor does it guarantee permanent separation in an emotional sense. Instead, it creates conditions where truth becomes more likely to surface without distortion. If reconnection ever happens, it emerges from a different emotional state than before. It is no longer driven by unconscious attachment patterns at their most reactive intensity, but by awareness shaped through absence and reflection. And if reconnection does not happen, the internal shift still remains because understanding does not require reunion to exist. In this way, silence is not simply what ends communication between two people. It is what transforms the meaning of that communication after it ends. It allows emotional experience to move from external dependency into internal integration. And in that transition, what appears as an ending reveals itself as a process of unfolding understanding that continues long after contact has stopped. Thank you for being here and allowing these words to reach your heart and awareness. Goodbye, and may your silence become the place where your strength and clarity are reborn.